Hi, this is a video talking about Buddhism, Buddhist philosophy, how we know what we think we know about Buddhism from the study of ancient texts. A small number of people who come to this YouTube channel are aware of my former life as a scholar of Theravada Buddhism. If you're not aware, you can figure out how to spell my name and put it into Google and pretty quickly and easily find articles and other fragments from that life I lived. Though it's a small number of people who watch the videos I make about Buddhism, I'm aware that those videos can have quite a big impact on them. I have had email from people about the ways in which my videos about Buddhism have changed their lives. However, the purpose of this YouTube channel is not to preach Buddhism, it's not to critique Buddhism, it's not to talk about my former life as a scholar of Buddhist studies. This YouTube channel, on the one hand, simply reflects whatever I've got going on in the present tense. So, for example, when I was working on the politics of China, several videos were uploaded here talking about Chinese politics. When I was learning Chinese as a language, I uploaded several videos about the Chinese language. So that type of material is going to change from month to month, depending on what I've got going on in my life. If I get a job at Starbucks, it's quite possible I will start uploading videos talking about what it's like to work behind the counter of a Starbucks. That's a thought, man. That might be a nice change for me around here. Unfortunately, I'm vegan, so there's not all that much at Starbucks I can make without a shudder of moral objection. At any rate, look, so on the one hand, this channel is about whatever's going on in my life right now. And on the other hand, this channel exists so that one day my daughter can see it. I have a 2-year-old daughter who lives in Europe, whom I basically never get to see. I'm hoping to see her this December, and you may get videos about that. But one day in the future, she can know what kind of guy I was. So with all that having been said, look, if you're watching this and you have no idea why you should pay attention to this bald guy talking about Buddhism, it's understandable. You can do some Google searches. I was invited to give a lecture on Buddhism at the University of Oxford at one point by the great Richard Gombrich. I was invited to give a university at SOAS, the University of London. I actually took these invitations and gave those lectures, by the way, if you haven't guessed. I also gave lectures on Buddhism actually in academic contexts in Cambodia and in Taiwan. I remember giving lectures on Buddhism, 2 lectures at a Buddhist university in Taiwan. I have never given a lecture at a university in Canada. Not formally. And when professors talk to me here about Buddhism, they often are impressed after a short discussion that I know so much. I have a great depth of knowledge in the field and depth of practical experience and depth of useful cynical advice about what's going on in the field. And I point out to them, well, you know, you could book a room and you could invite me to give a lecture here at the University of Victoria or what have you. They don't do that. So the type of ambition a Canadian institution has to take advantage of the talent that it's got, the talent that's already on campus, is very different from the way American and British institutions operate, without even getting into the question of actually getting out of your chair and going and recruiting talent from elsewhere. Anyway, that's a digression from within a digression. This video is going to read out and respond to you. I'm going to add some spontaneous comments to an article I wrote back in the year 2012. This article was originally titled Descent from the Top, Reading Ancient Buddhist Texts as Historical Evidence. So, as with many of my writings, my concern here is how we construct modern myths out of ancient myths, and often how we convince ourselves that in reading mythology, we are actually reading isolated historical facts. Now, one of the inoffensive examples I can give of that, and that I often do use in conversation with people, is the Greek god Heracles. And nobody gets offended because nobody worships Heracles as a god anymore. But Heracles really was a god. Heracles has to be taken very seriously, historically, as a major religious figure, which does not mean that he existed. Does not mean we have any text or any painting or any decorated urn showing Heracles, showing Hercules, that really gives us a scene from history. It doesn't mean we have any stories that were written even with the author's intent of describing a real historical figure, as opposed to preserving mythology or telling a moral fable or serving some other intention of the author. But it is very easy. It is all too easy to slip into a mentality of sifting through a myth to pick out the portions that we wish to imagine to be historical evidence. So what do I mean? If you read a collection of stories about Heracles, it's very easy to look at them and say, okay, the most supernatural stories are fiction, and in certain stories, the supernatural elements and impossible elements are exaggeration, but that at the core of the story, the core, which is something we imagine, something we ascribe to the story. It's not something written in the story. At the core of the story, there are real historical facts that were later embellished upon, exaggerated about, transformed into legend and myth, what have you. Today, in the year 2015, some stories about Heracles are still popular, are still widely remembered, and others are virtually forgotten. The death of Heracles, the tragic death of Heracles, for some reason is not popular, is not widely remembered. But like most legendary figures and most major religious figures, his death is dramatic. And you can describe his death in practical terms. You can omit all of the supernatural material and just say, Heracles cheated on his wife. He got a new girlfriend. His wife was jealous. And his wife poisoned him, so he died. Now, that sounds like it could be an historical event, and it's very easy, without even observing your thought process, for you to slip into construing that myth as having originally been, of having been at its core, a description of an actual king who was poisoned by his wife, who betrayed his wife, simply because that is believable from our modern, rational, scientific perspective. Now, I can describe the same myth to you by including and giving emphasis to the supernatural elements, which is that the woman Heracles married was riding on the back of a centaur, and Heracles shot the centaur with a bow while the centaur was swimming through water. And while the centaur was dying, as a dying curse, the centaur told Heracles' wife to collect the blood from his wound and to use it as a magical potion if Heracles' heart should ever stray. Now, I may be getting some of the details of that myth wrong. It's been many years since I read the drama of the death of Heracles. But now instead, this is obviously a richly symbolic, abstract, mythological tale. And the intent of the author may be various things. It may be written primarily to entertain children. It may be written primarily with a religious purpose, encoded in religious symbolism we don't know. It may just be a legend for the sake of a legend. Some of the stories we tell, action-adventure stories, exist just for the sake of the action-adventure. But now, simply by shifting the focus, simply by including these facts that were omitted before, it's not credible to say this story began with a real historical event and the other elements arose as embellishments. Even if we were willing to believe that there were at some point magical creatures called half man, half horse creatures that had poison for blood or something, considered from a historical position, the whole thing is preposterous. And it doesn't seem reasonable that the author is merely being inaccurate in recording real historical events. Instead, it seems that the author's intent has nothing to do with recording history. So this article I wrote in 2012, which, as you'll see, broaches some of these same issues within Buddhism, where people are much more defensive and much less willing to discuss those questions in an open and constructive way, begins as follows. Suppose someone formed their opinion of Buddhism based solely on the articles on my own blog. A scenario only slightly stranger than meeting someone whose opinion of Buddhism is based entirely on kung fu movies, and yet much less common. The question might then be asked, given all of this supernatural material in the canon, that you complain about other Western interpreters selectively ignoring, etc. Why does anyone think of these texts as records of specific historical events at all? So that is the question. Why do we read mythology and think that we're seeing history? Article continues. In a roundabout way, questions of that kind do reach me. I received an utterly unexpected response from an established, PhD-wielding career academic specialized in Buddhism, who felt that my work supported his own conclusion that the Pali Canon contained no description of the Buddha as an historical figure at all, nor, in this professor's opinion, did the text depict him as a human being. This was both astounding and hilarious, as I then had to provide this professor with a link to one of my prior articles in reply. I had already written an article titled, "The Buddha was Bald," to discuss the descriptions that we have in the Pali Canon that do indeed make the Buddha seem like a normal human being, with nothing supernatural about his appearance, etc. I have never heard back from that professor again. Socratic method is dead, apparently. Now, it's worth noting, this is part of the hyper-fragility of Western academia in dealing with Buddhism. At the very beginning of that anecdote, I said, well, in a roundabout way, questions of this kind do reach me. They should reach me directly. It should be the case that we live in a world where scholars deal with these questions head on, that these are issues of real debate, original research, a reconsideration of the ancient texts. None of that's the case. Instead, as in this case, I have been talking to this professor about the possibility of my getting a PhD, studying with him, and this guy was so fragile, so unprepared for any discussion of historical texts and evidence from historical texts, that when he told me his pet theory that the Pali Canon doesn't describe the Buddha as an historical figure or as a natural human person, he imploded as soon as I mentioned a well-written, fully cited, fully referenced article to the contrary. I don't know any other field of study that works that way. I don't know, you can't be in a department of physics and say to a student who's applying to get a PhD with you, an advanced student who's applying to do graduate work, oh, by the way, here's my personal pet theory about the speed of light. And the student writes back and says, oh, okay, well, that's interesting, but actually, I've published a theory to the contrary, and here are my sources, and then shut it down. No, obviously, even in a field like physics, Socratic method is important. Scrutiny and debate and completing claims to the truth, competing sources of factual evidence have to be contrasted. And that has to go on in the study of ancient Greek, and the study of ancient Latin, and the study of ancient Sanskrit. I would hope it goes on in the study of medieval French, Italian, 15th century Chinese in any field. But I gotta tell you, it is not going on in Buddhist studies. And this is one of my main reasons for why I quit that field, and why I've now started at, chapter 1, page 1 with how to learn Japanese. It was not my dream in life to become a scholar of modern Japanese, but having studied so many other things, that's the position I now find myself in. And it is, frankly, partly due to the real failure of both Western academia and Eastern academia in Buddhist studies, and these types of hyper-fragile attitudes of professors who often are not capable of being honest with themselves about what their own beliefs were when they first got started in Buddhism, and how the accumulated exposure they have to historical evidence has challenged those beliefs. I will not say his name, but another professor, a professor in England, he got started as a member of a notorious cult in Buddhism. He was involved with the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, headed by an infamous white British monk who had numerous charges of sexual misconduct against him, very well substantiated, documented in an article by the Guardian newspaper and in other articles. But anyway, that professor, obviously, at every stage of his involvement with Buddhism, his attitudes had to change. At one point, he was a kid who didn't know that much, who got involved with this cult. I don't know how old he was when he got involved. At some point, his opinion of that cult changed. I found, just through Google, I found some of his comments on the internet reflecting that time when he was losing his faith in that modern cult. I don't know, did he lose his faith in the ancient religion also? But his attitude must have changed. And then he must have gone through a series of stages where, in earning a PhD and in reading these texts, how you view Buddhism at each stage of its historical development has to change. To quote the infamous dictator Joseph Stalin, quantitative buildup leads to qualitative change. When you read just one myth, you'll have a view of it, you'll have your opinion on that myth, you may have certain types of excuses in mind in reading the myth, like we just talked about with Hercules, where you're sifting through the myth and choosing some elements and treating them as historical evidence and ignoring other elements. When you've read 10 myths, 100 myths, 1,000 myths, your perspective on each of them is different. Your perspective on the whole is different. And your perspective on different historical periods is different. You have to develop as an intellectual. Now, a lot of these professors, like the ones I just told this anecdote about, I think instead are trying to cling to the jejune faith of their lost youth. They still want to believe the things they believed as a teenager, or maybe that they believed in their early 20s, but that they can't believe anymore because they know better. And that is very sad, and that's very tragic, but it's also very common to the religious experience. I think there are a lot of people in Christianity who had maybe a childlike faith in Jesus, a childlike faith in the Bible. And when they were teenagers and decided to go to a seminary, go to a religious college, when they decided to earn a PhD in biblical studies, they maybe still had this childlike faith and these teenage attitudes. And then at some point as they got older, they hit a breaking point where, for example, where you know so much about the Bible that you can't believe the Bible has supernatural origins. You have to believe the Bible was written by human beings. So do you go into a sort of deeper denial, or do you deal with that and move on? Unlike Christianity, unlike Islam, I certainly think it is possible to be a good Buddhist and to be a good Buddhist and to regard the ancient texts as being merely the product of human hands, as being written by human beings, and as containing many errors and myths and fables. The nature of the evidence, for anyone who's really read this stuff, I don't know what other option there is. But yeah, in theory at least, there are people who literally believe in the supernatural revelation of some Buddhist texts, that some of the Buddhist texts were brought down from heaven by basically the angels working for Indra, by supernatural forces. There are people who believe some Buddhist texts were hidden in a cave by magical dragons called Nagas and were then revealed from that cave. If you believed that as a child and then you ever engage in textual study, I don't see how any of those myths could be sustainable. And I don't see how any view of the Buddha as omniscient, as godlike, could be sustainable if you're just familiar with the diversity of texts about him. Anyway, sorry. So we continue now with my old article. Socratic method is dead, apparently. We should be debating these issues in Western academia, and we're not. We should be debating these issues in Eastern academia, and we're not. I'm not all that upset about the failure of Western academia because I'm more upset about the failure of academia in places like Thailand, Japan, Hong Kong. Asia should be the home of where original research on Buddhism is being conducted, and it's not. So the failure of Western academia is more important because of the failure of Eastern academia. But believe me, this kind of Socratic discourse is not taking place in journals of Buddhist studies published in Japan. I can make a whole other video about my experiences with journals of Buddhist studies based in Japan. The question of whether the Buddha is described as natural, supernatural, or alternating between the two is a fairly narrow issue. We have a broader problem in questioning his status as an historical figure in any of the texts or in accordance with any possible archaeological evidence, etc. Even so, the latter question is still narrower than the universal problem of why anyone regards any of the ancient texts as real historical evidence, as opposed to religious fables, and why other texts in the same canon are disregarded as merely fables. In effect, modern interpreters end up selectively disregarding some texts while insisting on the importance of others. One of the real ghosts haunting popular philology, I'll say that again. One of the great ghosts haunting popular philology is the Criterion of Embarrassment. This is not a technical concept. Its origin is in a book sold in airport lobbies, and it was neither narrowly defined by academics nor by religious authorities. The Criterion of Embarrassment comes from this guy, Will Durant. Will Durant. And Will Durant was not a scholar of Buddhism. He was not a scholar of ancient Egypt. He was not a scholar of anything. But he wrote popular nonfiction. Nonfiction that was enormously influential. It sold in airport lobbies. It influenced, BBC radio. It influenced documentaries that were recorded and played on the radio, on television. It was massively influential at that level of the popular mass media consumption of history. Dumbed down history. And part of the problem is not that it's dumbed down for the audience, but that the guy writing it really does not know enough to be dumbing down something as contentious as ancient Buddhism. And in this book, it's not like it's 80% right and 20% wrong and misleading. It is 100% garbage. But in books like this by Will Durant, you see the authoritative, self-confident presentation of modern myths about Buddhism, modern misconceptions, not misconceptions that come from ancient texts, but that people widely believe today, being presented as settled fact. This is from the 1950s. But in the 1950s, there was already we had a 100-year plus old tradition of Europeans making up complete bullshit about Buddhism and selling it to other Europeans. So in here, this also contains a lot of propaganda for Mohandas Gandhi, the political leader in India and so on. All the kind of bullshit hippie misconceptions about the Orient, about India, China, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. You can find the proof, the false proof for those notions in this popular book, in all the writings of Will Durant from the 1950s. So again, if you know the popularity of that, the type of cultural influence it had, it's not at all surprising that views that were prevalent in the 1960s were influenced by these books from the 1950s, and that did get recycled in documentaries and what have you. Okay, but I'm specifically talking here about Will Durant's idea of the Criterion of Embarrassment, which again was not really... It wasn't a technical, scientific, philological idea. It was an idea that came from these popular books by this popular author who did not know what he was talking about and who made even more popular misconceptions about ancient Egypt, ancient India, Buddhism, Hinduism, you name it. Inspired a whole lot of people to take vacations in India, I'm sure. I can use the same example from the top of the video about the death of Heracles, the death of Hercules. It's very easy to think, okay, Hercules was a real hero. He was a strong man who became a king by killing a lot of people. He fought a lot of sword fights. And when he died, when he was poisoned by his wife, his fans were embarrassed by this. They were trying to compensate for this. So they invented a myth. They embellished on the embarrassing fact of his death. So this is not embarrassment in a kind of common sense. The point isn't that people were blushing and covering their mouths and giggling. It's not embarrassment about sexual material in mythology. But this is construing the myth as an attempt to compensate for an inconvenient historical fact. Many people think this way without realizing it. It's very easy to look at that myth of Heracles and say, okay, there must have been a real historical fact of him cheating on his wife and being poisoned, and then the rest of the myth is to compensate for that, is to deal with that so-called embarrassment. So, in terms of the influence this has been massively influential in how all modern Western people think about the history of religion. Many people in reading the Old Testament notice peculiar facts about Moses in the Old Testament in Judaism. Moses cannot speak well. Moses has something like a lisp or a stutter. Moses is described as having a speech pathology, a speech problem. So he's not a public speaker. Many people look at that and say, okay, that's an embarrassing fact in this sense. So the fact that the mythology compensates for this problem, the fact that we have an explanation or an excuse for this, means that there was a real historical fact there that's being compensated for, i.e., therefore, Moses is not a purely fictional or purely mythological figure, that therefore there was a real person. And this criterion of embarrassment, the fact that we can see a compensation for something inconvenient for the storytellers, must entail that there was a real Moses. Now, that is false. If you think about each step of consideration there, it is a completely false inference that's impossible to support. That's not how we establish the historical reality of a person. And if you apply that to mythology or to well-written fiction, then almost any work of fiction becomes historical reality, because it is natural for people to create believable obstacles, believable character flaws in their heroes, even if you create a completely fictional hero. Why does Robin Hood lose in some of his battles? Robin Hood loses in his fight with Little John. They have a fight on the river. Isn't this an embarrassment? Doesn't this show that Robin Hood is a real historical figure? No, not at all. Even in works of pure fantasy, even in works of the wildest imagination and fiction, people create obstacles that the heroes can't overcome. People create character flaws for mythological figures. And also, we have to admit our own alienness from the culture. I do not know enough about ancient Greek culture to know why the story of the death of Heracles was so meaningful and so resonant, what it reflected thematically. I don't know that much about the symbolism that may be involved in the poisoning and so on. So, and there's a certain arrogance if I, as a modern person, look at that myth and say, oh, well, this can't possibly have any meaning aside from being an attempt to embellish a real historical event where a certain king in ancient Greece was poisoned by his wife over jealousy because the husband had cheated on the wife. That's kind of a modern hubris to look at it that way. The type of symbolism, the life of Moses in the Old Testament, if you spend a little bit of time learning about First Temple Judaism, ancient Judaism, you realize that many of the events in the life of Moses, many of the events in the life of Jesus, are really purely symbolic. And they probably were very meaningful to the people who wrote them at the time. But they are not meaningful to us in the same way. Jesus goes and visits a tree. The tree doesn't have any fruit when it's out of season, so Jesus asks God to destroy the tree. I'm not going to get into it here, but this is not an embarrassing incident where a real historical person got angry at a tree for having no fruit and said that God should destroy the tree. It is an entirely symbolic narrative that was meaningful to people at the time and really reflects and concerns political conditions in Israel at that time, the destruction of the temple, Roman occupation, etc. You can get to the politics of the New Testament and what that reflects, what resonated about it. There's a lot here. There's a lot to talk about. But unfortunately, this idea of the Criterion of Embarrassment was massively influential because it was popularized by this guy, Will Durant, who is now... He's not remembered in the same flattering light that he was thought of during his lifetime. And look, I'm going to give one concession to this guy. I think his work is complete garbage. Complete garbage. But it is true that he lived at a time when most of the Western world was intensely racist and intensely pro-empire. And even in giving his work this sort of title, Our Oriental Heritage, he is trying in his way to make people in England and America less racist, less intolerant, less dismissive in their attitudes towards religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. So in that respect, yes, his heart was in the right place. And yes, I can see why the BBC, the CBC, probably in America, the Disney Corporation, why popular purveyors of documentaries popularizing history would fasten onto a book like this and say, yes, this is just what we're looking for. This is just the flattering view. This is just the angle of the history of India and the history of China we want to popularize, basically to try to make white people less racist, basically to try to make people who were raised in a British or American education system more sensitive to the idea that Asia has its own written history, its own religions, its own traditions that are worth knowing about and worth understanding in their own terms. That's it. That's the only positive thing I have to say about Will Durant. Everything he says about Buddhism is garbage and is misleading and is pernicious. And the legacy of that kind of writing, its influence, is still with us today. Okay. If you look around the internet for debates employing the idea of the criterion of embarrassment, you'll find that they both demonstrate a diversity of implicit definitions of what it means, and you'll also see that the authors, often enough, debate amongst themselves the problem of how exactly this criterion should be used. Pardon me. Given that the term is legitimately contestable in its meaning, it is easier for me to give an example of how it applies to Buddhist studies than it is to define it. Mahamoggallana. Boy, I'm out of practice in pronouncing Pali. Mahamoggallana. Hey, I've been pronouncing Japanese lately. Think about the list of languages I've studied since I stopped learning Pali. I stopped learning Pali and I studied Cree, a little tiny bit of Ojibwe, Chinese, and now Japanese. I studied even more languages before that. I worked on Pali, Cambodian, French, German, etc. But let me tell you, to say I'm rusty on Pali is an understatement. Anyway, Mahamoggallana is the name of a Buddhist monk, and I am not correctly pronouncing the long A vowels here. Moggallana. Yeah, you're not going to chant along with this video. Anyway, Mahamoggallana was one of two monks who were expected to inherit the leadership of Buddhism as a then new religion at the time of the Buddha's death. Okay, so to pause, to be clear, when the Buddha was alive, he selected two monks and said, these are my two chief disciples, these are the best monks, however you want to phrase it. And the Buddha said that when he died, these two monks should take over the leadership of Buddhism. And obviously, while the Buddha was still alive, the idea of what Buddhism was supposed to be was still to some extent open-ended and contested and new, right? Admittedly, I'm presuming the Buddha is a real historical figure who really was alive in my description of these events. And some of you might challenge me on that. Okay. Socratic method is dead. Despite the fact that both of these monks were younger than the Buddha, they both predeceased him. And Mahamoggallana was reportedly murdered. Okay, so this is massively significant for the history of Buddhism, or even for the mythology of Buddhism, if you regard this as containing no real historical facts. But we have here the inconvenient fact that the two monks the Buddha selected to become the leaders after his death, they died before the Buddha died, even though they were younger than the Buddha. Okay? In many ways, I think the tension surrounding this story is much more meaningful than the sort of tension surrounding Moses. Why was it Moses was never allowed to see the Promised Land? Why was it that Moses couldn't speak clearly? Why was the succession, the control of the leadership of Buddhism, contested at the time of the death of the Buddha? Why was it disputed who would inherit control of Buddhism? The texts concerning Mahamoggallana are full of the magical and the supernatural, and the events surrounding his death are further embellished upon in the commentaries. So, for those of you who don't know, there's the original ancient Pali text, and then there are later texts called the commentaries. That is not debated. The fact that the commentaries are written historically later is not debated. That is as close to an undisputed historical fact as anything gets in Buddhism. So the difference between text and commentary. The Pali text and then the commentaries are also written in Pali. But there are big differences between the two. Modern readers tend to regard the death of Mahamoggalana as an historical fact, even if they regard all of the stories told about it as mythology. How is that possible? If your only evidence is myth, why would you suppose that you have evidence of anything other than mythology? Well, there is this dubious thing called the Criterion of Embarrassment. In general, modern readers suppose that the untimely death of both of the monks who had been appointed to inherit authority was a subject of embarrassment, in the particular sense that required further explanation and justification. Even if the myths are largely fiction, modern readers tend to suppose that the reason for creating the myth was real. The supposition is that a story needed to be invented to explain away an inconvenient fact. However, this whole attitude remains one of supposition. Departing from the text again, we also have this problem of hubris that we as modern readers really know the undeclared intention of the authors here. So, if the story concerning the circumstances of Mahamoggalana's death, the death of this monk, if that is an invention to conceal something, to serve some other purpose, how do we know what's being concealed? How do we know what the author's intent was? If we're even assuming that this is a real historical fact, that this death, this murder took place. Well, to give one example that, again, we should have debate about, we should have Socratic discourse about, the story we have, the legend of the death that we have, blames the Jain religion, which is also pronounced the Jain religion today, Jain. So the Jains are blamed for the murder of this important monk. Well, there was real religious tension, real conflict between Buddhism and Jainism as two religions in this period, in the same historical period in India. How do we know this story wasn't invented just for sectarian reasons, just because the author, the person who wrote it, was part of a real contest, a real conflict between these two religions? That's just a supposition. That's just a modern thesis. However, it's not easily dismissed. Likewise, the idea that the story around his death was invented for any other reason. For example, someone might have created this myth just to explain why, when the Buddha died, Mahamoggalana did not become the leader of Buddhism. That, as the texts indicate, there was some kind of struggle to control the Buddhist religion at this crucial juncture. And the person who won that struggle was not the person the Buddha selected. Well, it would be convenient to say, oh, that's because he was murdered, and he was murdered by a rival religious order, by the Jains, by Jainism. So that's also convenient. But we don't know. And the accounts of his death are supernatural. They are just as impossible to believe as the death of Heracles. There's enough supernatural stuff involved that nobody could read that and possibly believe this is an eyewitness account of a real historical fact. Now, also, if you read that story, I'm not going to get into the details, it's not even clear who could have witnessed it, because nobody is there, and he magically teleports and stuff. Well, it's like, so who's telling the story? I mean, who was it who witnessed these impossible events to tell the story, given that he's alone when these things happen and the magic involved? So you get into kind of surreal, self-contradictory logic, even if you want to believe that it's a real historical event. Okay. Returning to the text here. Many people who don't use the term criterion of embarrassment nevertheless share in this basic attitude towards textual evidence, and many people complain that the word embarrassment itself is poorly suited to the meaning of the phrase and is an unwanted distraction, etc. The point here isn't that ancient Buddhists were embarrassed by the death of Mahamoggalana itself. Rather, the assumption is that modern readers can infer that the invention of the myth served as a type of compensation for a real historical event, and that we can further infer what that real event was that the authors are compensating for. It all seems so obvious, and yet it is really very dubious. Was Mahamogalana really murdered by Jains? If we have a myth stating that he was, couldn't this text reflect tensions between the two religions, Buddhism versus Jainism, at the time of the myth's authorship, rather than recording a prior historical event? Can we really selectively disregard supernatural elements of a story that would tend to categorize it as myth, simply because there were other elements that seem, to us, with modern eyes, to indirectly reveal real events? Could it be, conversely, that these myths cover over something completely different that we can't guess at, from the mere supposition that something is concealed? Okay, sorry I tripped on the word supposition there. So again, coming back to an example like myths around Moses, or Jesus praying for the destruction of the fruit tree. A very small number of biblical scholars have unpacked the symbolism from that culture at that time, the implied meaning and the significance of those events. Of course, they're still debated and disputed. But the point is, a normal modern person reading in English translation, could not read those myths about Moses and Jesus and understand the ancient Jewish cultural assumptions and social conditions, what have you, that surround the myth and that inform the author's purpose and that really reveal to you the significance of the myth. So with some areas of ancient Buddhist texts, these are also real stumbling blocks, where sometimes we have a story, but we don't know why the story is being told or what it's hinting at. Sometimes we have a criticism of another religion, but we don't really know what's being criticized or why. Throughout the Pali Canon, the sun worshippers, people who worship the sun, they have a really bad reputation. I've never seen an explanation within the canon for why, for what was the problem. And I don't know why. Maybe in that period in India, the sun worshippers were engaging in some sort of rituals that were extremely offensive to Buddhists, whether animal sacrifice rituals or human sacrifice or sex rituals, I don't know. But there are some cases where the texts preserve evidence of a religious and cultural nature that I have no further way to interpret. Okay, so these are the ways in which even a very simple text can be complicated. That scene in the New Testament with Jesus condemning the fruit tree, it's only a few sentences long. It's not involuted. It's not complex when you look at it on the page in English. But to understand what's going on there, why the myth exists, and what it's trying to tell the reader in the period it was originally written, what it means in that context, that is complicated. So we can have some of the same problems in looking at ancient Buddhist texts. Could it be, conversely, that these myths cover over something completely different that we can't guess at from the mere supposition that something is being concealed? Human nature being what it is, we might say, at least hypothetically, that there could have been a power struggle to determine who inherited control of the religion around the time of the Buddha's death. As such, it could be that the myth isn't concealing the inconvenient fact of Mahamogalana's death, but instead that it's concealing the convenient fact that the death itself was a myth. If we started from the skeptical assumption that Mahamogalana might not have been dead prior to the Buddha's death, we would then interpret the written myths as offering an explanation of his absence, i.e. his exclusion, from power thereafter. That would be wholly speculative. However, the problem with the Criterion of Embarrassment is that every theory it supports is wholly speculative. We cannot reduce the degree of speculation even if we employ Occam's razor. There is absolutely no reason why the simplest available explanation for the invention of a myth would be more true than a convoluted one. So I'll pause here. This also relates to the nature of concealment. If you know I'm lying to you, if you know I'm concealing evidence about something, then there's no reason to assume that my reason for lying will be the simplest reason possible. Quite the contrary. My reasons may be complex. So if a myth is not written for sincere and direct reasons, if it's not telling us what it openly and overtly and directly is telling us, then the simplest explanation is irrelevant. Why did people write this myth about Jesus damning a fruit tree, asking God to blight, to destroy a fruit tree. The point was not to tell us that you can have the magical superpower to destroy a fruit tree. The actual point is convoluted, is complicated. It's not the simplest available explanation. Because that's how mythology works. And, again, it might have been simple or obvious to the audience that it was written for in that historical period. But, likewise, even if you read Shakespeare, sometimes the joke in Shakespeare, like there's a concealed joke, it's very convoluted. It's very difficult to explain today what the joke is. It was obvious to some people in the audience at that time, but the symbolic references, the cultural references, etc., have been forgotten today. So you can't use Occam's razor for this sort of thing. Now, there is an overall sense in which we do use Occam's razor. When we look at the historical figure of the Buddha, you have to ask, what is the simplest explanation? Is it simpler to imagine that ultimately there was an historical figure? Or is it simpler to imagine there never was an historical figure and these myths were created without a unique person existing to inspire the mythology? Most people who have profound long-term exposure to these ancient texts tend to say, it's easier to assume there really was a guy, ultimately, who inspired this literature, and that some of his idiosyncrasies, some of his personal decisions, are reflected in the literature that we have. Although the mythology about him is very indirect. Was there an historical Heracles? Was there an historical Avalokiteshvara? So Avalokiteshvara is another Buddhist god. And we know for a fact that this god never existed as a person. The origins of that god are symbolic and abstract. So even then, even with this type of very basic theory, such as the Buddha was a person, it seems like an incredibly simple theory. Actually, Occam's razor is irrelevant. Actually, the question of what we do with mythological evidence is very complicated and difficult. Unlike the pure sciences, or even the medical sciences, neither mythology nor history are susceptible to Occam's famous principle. The simplest explanation for why Napoleon went to war with Russia may be utterly false. His reasons may have been extremely convoluted, etc. And the simplest explanation for various myths that have been made up about the ensuing war may also be false. Propaganda isn't counted as one of the pure sciences. Right, so that's a good point I forgot that I made. What I've just said about history, what I've just said about mythology is also true of history. We can't make Occam's razor inferences about historical decisions that we know are real historical decisions any more than we can about mythological decisions. Why did President Nixon decide to continue with the Vietnam War? The reasons may be really complicated, and the fact that you can come up with a very simple explanation, a single reason at a single time, may be completely irrelevant. So we can't, these types of inferences do apply to the pure sciences, but do not apply to mythology, religion, history, politics. Given that we're looking at an uncertain mix of mythology and history, the principle of parsimony is doubly misleading. So the principle of parsimony is another name for Occam's razor. Unlike the laws of physics, we're investigating a story that intentionally conceals something. The motives of the authors may be complex. We don't even know to what extent they regarded themselves as writing fact, fiction, or a mixture of the two. So again, this is why the intention of the author is so important. When you read an ancient Greek author like Thucydides, we know that his intention was to get rid of mythology. We know that he was trying to write real history and record real political decisions and political facts. But when you're looking at mythology that may have been written mostly to entertain children, or maybe written in order to inspire a certain type of ethical lifestyle, or just to inspire people to care about certain rituals so they know the importance of performing magical rituals, the intention of the author is not to record an historical fact. In the 21st century, if we were to speculate as to the inspiration for a particular song's lyrics, the simplest explanation has no reason to be more true than a convoluted one. In looking for historical facts that may be masked within a work of art, simplicity need not correlate to accuracy. Although simplicity may make our analysis seem more logical, our conclusions are not any less speculative for that reason. So anyone who has a background in art history would know sometimes the reason why a painting was created and the symbolic meaning of features in paintings can be extremely complicated and indirect if you are looking at a painting that has a concealed or hidden message. And sometimes, by the way, paintings, the hidden message is just to thank the donor, to thank the patrons, thank the people who paid for the painting. But it can be very convoluted. Returning to the question that opened the essay, why does anyone regard any of this stuff as historical evidence of anything at all? Well, as a broad aesthetic tendency, I think that most of us, i.e. modern readers, really do share in the mentality of the Criterion of Embarrassment, and the canonical texts offer us various critical and self-critical remarks about the imperfect development of early Buddhism that seem all too easy to believe in. It isn't the case that all of the monks in the canon are paragons of virtue. Instead, we have many acrimonious dialogues preserved in which the monks disagree about philosophy, or sometimes accuse one another of ethical lapses and moral misconduct. So again, I just pause. This is the sense in which many people who read the Pali Canon feel that it is much more historically authentic than the Old Testament or the New Testament. Just the human fallibility, the human imperfection of many of the characters. The fact that you see Buddhist monks criticizing and complaining about other Buddhist monks. You see Buddhist monks going and complaining to the Buddha, this monk is a jerk, this monk is doing something bad. So again, as with the case of Moses stuttering or not being able to speak clearly, those types of human imperfections very often have an effect on the readers of convincing them that these books as a whole are recording historical facts. As I've already said, that is very misleading, and it's not appropriate to let yourself fall into those assumptions in an unexamined way. You have to be rigorous and self-disciplined in your evaluation of the evidence. So I write here, there is no real reason why we should regard a story about a bad monk as more historically real than a story about a good monk. But this is a natural human bias. If I read a story in the newspaper about a corrupt politician, I am probably going to believe it simply because it seems plausible to me that the politician is corrupt. If I read a story in the newspaper telling me that a certain politician is a paragon of virtue, he is not corrupt in any way, he's completely honest, he's completely accountable, and he's doing a great job, I will most likely disregard that or be very skeptical or critical. So this is a bias on the part of the reader. And both of those newspaper stories may be entirely true or accurate. Both of them may be false and misleading. Okay? So when we look at the Pali Canon, why do we assume that stories about bad monks are accurate and stories about good monks are mythology or propaganda or misleading, whatever? Okay. We should be aware of this tendency of thought that elects to do precisely that. We tend to treat texts as factual if they contain criticism, self-criticism, conflict, and explanations for what seem to be inconvenient facts. We tend to regard the absence of these things in an otherwise grandiose narrative as mythical. If the canon described everyone as levitating and radiating magical beams all the time, etc., nobody today would believe any of it. Nobody would really be interested in it, and the whole canon would probably be thought of as quite boring, in contrast to the human drama of other ancient sources, such as the myth of Heracles. However, the Pali Canon does preserve very down-to-earth reflections on the state of the religion alongside the supernatural narratives, and sometimes mixed in with them indifferently. This is the sense in which Buddhism is, frankly, more interesting than the myths of Heracles. The religion was intensely aware of its own corruption from the outset, and it was intensely concerned about the misunderstanding of its own philosophy, even within its first group of core followers. The canon preserves a record of many of those concerns, debates, complaints, remonstrations, etc., although these are not separate from the mythological material in the texts themselves, and they definitely do not comprise an earlier stratum whereby anyone could or should disregard the mythological material as later strata. More fundamentally, we should admit to ourselves that we have no clear criterion as to what may be called a myth anyway, nor of how or why anything should be separated out from the text as a non-myth. Instead, readers just operate on the basis of their own sentiment and something like the Criterion of Embarrassment. Returning to the question of who inherited power at the time of the Buddha's death, I would look very briefly at the example of Mahakassapa. Whereas the two monks appointed to inherit power did not do so, reportedly due to their untimely demise, Kassapa was the man who actually did take over control of the religion. Was he appointed to do so from the Buddha's deathbed? No. Reportedly, he wasn't present. However, as the myth goes, in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, which is a sutta within the Pali Canon, a suttanta within this corpus of ancient texts, the fact that he was intended to take over the leadership was indicated magically by the fact that the wood stacked up for the Buddha's funeral pyre refused to burn until Mahakassapa arrived to attend the funeral. No, I'm not making this up. The question is, who did and why? Okay? Now, I'm going to presume that my audience does not believe that divine intervention actually prevented the wood from lighting on fire, which is what the texts say, is that the gods, plural, the gods of ancient India, the gods would not allow the Buddha's funeral pyre, his funeral ritual, to proceed until Mahakassapa came and took over the leadership. That doesn't just sound like a myth, it sounds like an excuse, and a bad excuse, the more you know about Buddhism. It would be much more convenient if while the Buddha was dying, he said that he wanted Mahakassapa to come to his funeral, or if the Buddha said that he wanted Mahakassapa to become the leader of the religion. But the Buddha did not say that. We don't have a myth anywhere with the Buddha endorsing the leadership of Mahakassapa. Instead, we have the Buddha endorsing the leadership of two other people who did not become the leaders. Now, finally, again, you may or may not know Buddhism this well, but Buddhism is based on the instructions of the Buddha. It is not based on the instructions of the gods plural. The gods do say things. The gods do also have debates with the Buddha and other Buddhist monks. There are interactions with the gods. But what the whole Pali Canon denies is that the gods know anything that's really worth knowing. So Brahma is spoken to, but it's very explicitly said in the Pali Canon that Brahma doesn't know something that the Buddha doesn't know. Brahma and Indra, they don't seem to know anything that intelligent human beings would not know. So in that sense, they're similar to the gods of ancient Greece. They're not omnipotent and omniscient. They are superpowered, like our comic book characters, like superheroes today. They can fly through the air and they can kill you by throwing a lightning bolt at your head. Indra actually does that in the Pali Canon, by the way. He throws lightning bolts at people's heads and kills them. Once in a while. But Buddhism is absolutely not based on revealed principles or instructions from the gods. It is based exclusively on the revealed principles and instructions from the Buddha. So even if the gods did choose Mahakassapa to be the leader, and they did this through the incredibly indirect method of preventing a fire from being lit, not a very impressive form of divine intervention, that would still not be valid in Buddhism. There is no way that succession or monastic leadership, even today, even in Buddhism as it exists now, you are not supposed to select your leaders on the basis of divine intervention or funeral rituals or magical fire lighting rituals. This is one of the differences between Buddhism and other religions. How leadership is selected, by the way, for monks who are still alive today or for people in the last 1,000 years. There are some very boring texts you can read that outline the sort of legal principles of who is in charge when and who makes what decisions in a Buddhist Sangha, in a Buddhist religious community, either a men's religious community or women's religious community, in a monastic group. Okay? So this myth, apart from being preposterous and seeming to conceal something, is also doctrinally invalid. Which is to say, even if we are completely uncritical, pure believers, true believers in all the magical and supernatural elements of Buddhism, it's still not valid for the gods to have made this decision that they allegedly made. Funny how divine intervention is so often through invisible and suspicious means, eh? Okay. Yes, theoretically, it is possible that this is an actual historical event, but I don't think that anyone alive today interprets the text in this manner, not even the most pious of monks, and I've met many. Conversely, if the point of the myth were to legitimate the power of Mahakassapa, the question deserves to be asked, why didn't someone simply fabricate a decision on the part of the Buddha on his deathbed, saying that Kassapa should take over control of the religion? It may also be noted that the wood on the pyre does not speak with its own voice. Another important monk, Anuruddha, offers the explanation that the gods were preventing the fire from alighting until Kassapa could arrive. So again, we don't even have a myth of Indra coming down from the sky and delaying the funeral ritual. We just have another human being, a monk named Anuruddha, standing there and saying, no, you can't light the fire until this other monk arrives and takes over the leadership of the religion. Okay? So, yeah, the story of divine intervention very much seems like an embellishment on a very believable scenario of a power struggle for who should attend the funeral, probably who should preside over the rituals of the funeral at the time of the Buddha's death, and ultimately who would be present to debate and decide who was going to take over the leadership of this new religion. All right? Again, it is tempting to imagine that this myth preserves Anuruddha's support for Mahakassapa inheriting power, and that it is indirectly depicting the fact that Anuruddha wanted to delay the funeral proceedings until Kassapa and his supporters could arrive to advocate for his leadership. However, we don't know this. It is speculation of the crudest kind. Mahakassapa isn't even mentioned in the text, so the Mahaparinibbana Sutta is the text, until after the Buddha's death. He enters the narrative with the description of his absence, explained in reference to this issue of the funeral pyre remaining mysteriously flame retardant. Conversely, Sariputta, one of the monks who definitely was appointed to inherit power. So Sariputta is one of the two monks the Buddha named. So far, I only named the other monk. Conversely, Sariputta, one of the two monks who definitely was appointed to inherit power, is mentioned in the same text as speaking to the Buddha shortly prior to the Buddha's death, yet more than 3 months before, apparently, when the Buddha is still in Nalanda. So, incongruously, we have the Buddha praising the wisdom of Sariputta as part of the Buddha's death narrative, and then Sariputta simply disappears from the story with no mention of the fact that he was supposed to take over the leadership, nor any statements of the Buddha's disappointment that this wouldn't happen. Sariputta isn't mentioned again, neither as alive, nor dead, nor dying. Nor is he present at the funeral, nor is his absence at the funeral mentioned as significant. Meanwhile, Mahamoggalana isn't mentioned even once in the whole story, although he was the other man appointed to inherit the leadership, and he allegedly died subsequent to Sariputta, but still prior to the Buddha. Okay. This is complicated, especially if you're not a scholar of ancient Buddhist texts. If you are a scholar of ancient Buddhist texts, this is pretty simple. The point is, look, reading this text, this famous text, the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, reading the description of the Buddha's death, these elements don't make sense. And please understand, I am not evaluating this text as having supernatural origins. I am reading this text as something written by human beings who sat down and tried to write a legend, tried to write a coherent story surrounding the circumstances of the Buddha's death, and indeed, what happened to the religion, who inherited power, who took over once the Buddha had died. These are themes dealt with. But in looking at that story, it is not actually compatible with the explanations or excuses we have for why Buddhism was not led by the two people the Buddha appointed as leaders. Instead, it seems like this legend, the description of the death, the Mahabharata, that this legend was not even aware of the excuses that people made up, including the claims that both of the people selected to be the leaders of the religion were already dead. On the contrary, with Sariputta's case, it very much seems in the text, if you just read the text, not the commentary, the original Pali text, it very much seems that Sariputta is still alive. He's there and the Buddha talks to him a very short time before his death. And if Sariputta had suddenly died, and the Buddha was aware of it, if Mahamoggallana had suddenly died, if the two people you've appointed to inherit the control of the religion, if they had died, the Buddha would have discussed that or addressed that in this exact context. So it's suspicious. And while I do not want to give in to Occam's razor, one explanation for the aspects of these texts, plural, that are incoherent, that don't match up, is that Buddhists were having a difficult time giving a coherent account of what happened when leadership was taken over at the Buddha's death. That mythology, such as the gods preventing the funeral pyre from being lit, was added to this story in order to make a more pleasing, coherent, legendary, mythological narrative out of some somewhat inconvenient and confusing facts that people are still somewhat in denial about today, I might say. In terms of the chronology, wasn't Sariputta supposed to be dead all along? In retrospect, we are supposed to believe that both Sariputta and Mahamoggallana died just a few months before the Buddha's own funeral, and that news of this shocking turn of events reached the Buddha, and yet their deaths are not mentioned within the same text. If all of those deaths transpired in such rapid succession within the last 3 months of the Buddha's life, why would there be absolutely no mention of such an important drama in the midst of the very myth that details the last 3 months of the Buddha's life? So again, if the legend even said, wow, isn't this amazing, isn't this surprising or inconvenient that all three of these people died at the same time, that would be another story. But it doesn't do that. It doesn't even acknowledge this. So the pieces do not seem to match up. Okay? These were and it would be big news. It would be big, shocking news if these two guys had died. One of them murdered. One of them died from murder at exactly this point in time in the history of religion. It would be a big deal. And at least we would have mentioned the fact that they were not attending the funeral. Because in theory, you could say, well, maybe the Buddha didn't know about it yet, although the Buddha is supposed to be omniscient and have magical psychic powers to know these things, know exactly these kind of things, to know about the deaths of Buddhist monks who've achieved nirvana. He's supposed to be aware of this stuff. But anyway, on a more humanistic level, you could say, well, maybe they didn't know. Well, definitely at the funeral and the council, the proceedings that happened afterwards, definitely it would have been known and talked about at that time. And we have a very difficult to account for silence. Okay? These were the two chief disciples of the Buddha who were supposed to be in command after the Buddha's death. Are we expected to imagine that their own deaths are simply omitted as unimportant from this narrative? Why would it not be mentioned? It seems almost irresistible to imagine that we can unravel what the myth means and also what it conceals. The truth is that we can't. We don't know whether or not it was written to conceal anything, and we can never verify what it is concealing in particular. If these myths were written to serve a simple political purpose, Mahakassapa would instead be mentioned in the Buddha's final orations, and he would be unambiguously named as the intended successor throughout the canon. But he isn't. Instead, the canon preserves an incongruous and ambiguous situation at the time of the Buddha's death, despite the mythological and grandiose tropes that are built into the narrative. Nobody who studies the Pali Canon as a whole could have the sense that Mahakassapa's accession was obvious or uncontroversial. Sorry to repeat that. Nobody who studies these texts as a whole would have the feeling that Mahakassapa's leadership was something obvious, uncontroversial that happened by default. On the contrary, we have indications that no, this was controversial and this was not what the Buddha planned. And we know the Buddha's opinion of each of these monks and of controversies, accusations made against Mahakassapa We have some very interesting fragments of disputes, shall we say, which again leads us to think that these are real historical events because of the prejudice I mentioned earlier. When we read a newspaper story about a corrupt politician, we tend to believe it. And we tend to be skeptical about a story that a politician is completely blameless and faultless and wonderful. So these very fragments of accusations and counter-accusations give us the feeling that we're looking at an imperfect record of real historical events, even though that same record contains completely magical stuff, like the Buddha flying up into the sky and radiating flames out of his body, and monks going and talking to Brahma and Indra, and in this case, a very modest form of divine intervention in the gods preventing a fire from being lit. We're left with fragments of many strange controversies, and that inescapable feeling that we're looking at an imperfect record of real historical events, even though we're only looking at myths that we suppose to very indirectly reflect those events. Within the Pali Canon, Mahakassapa emerges as a very interesting and very human character, who deserves to be written about at greater length than I would do here. Mahakassapa offers us some of the most striking examples of descent from the top within the canon. He complains very directly about what he perceives to be wrong and corrupt within the religion. This also tugs at our sense of the criterion of embarrassment. Although we really have no evidence at all, the nature of the complaints themselves just seems so human and so believable that we easily take them as indirect evidence of something actual. So again, why is there no Socratic discourse about this? Why is there no really legit Buddhist scholarship discussing this stuff? We actually do have evidence that Mahakassapa had his own ideas about what the Buddhist religion should be, even while the Buddha was still alive. And then obviously, if he took over leadership, he would have informed and reformed and influenced what the religion became. So we should have evidence within the canon from within that period of time of how maybe the religion was different under the leadership of Kassapa and under the leadership of the Buddha. And I think we do. I think we actually can look through the text and find the influence of various monks. There are probably only a few examples, but yeah, we do have a sense of different personalities, different priorities, different religious ideas, and above all else, different ideas about monastic discipline, monastic rules, monastic practice. And we can see to some extent different human influences tugging at the legacy of Buddhism during the formative period when people were first creating the code of what Buddhism would become, what Buddhism should become. And one of the reasons for that, by the way, is that all of these people were members of different religions before. If you had been Hindu before converting to Buddhism, you would have a different set of cultural assumptions about monasticism, about the religious life, than someone who converted from Jainism, someone who converted from an animist religion, from sun worshipping, from worshipping spirits that are in the trees and the rivers. And again, if you've read the Pali Canon, you see that kind of diversity. There was tremendous diversity in the ethnicities, languages, religious backgrounds of the people who first joined Buddhism during the first generation of followers the religion had. So naturally, around the time of the death of the Buddhism, competing notions of how the religion should operate would be contested. And also, these are going to be eccentric people. You can see within the canon, some of them really believed very strongly in supernatural experiences. They believed in seeing ghosts, in seeing demons, in communicating with ghosts and demons. And that material is preserved in the Pali Canon. And there were other people who were authors contributing to the Pali Canon who were of a more skeptical and scientific mindset. So you see those contrasts within the canon. You even see some people who were skeptical about meditation and meditative revelation or experience. And of course, there were other authors who were not skeptical at all, who were enthusiastic in the religious sense. So yeah, the canon, the written canon, is a mixed bag because it preserves these kinds of contrasts and debates that were ongoing in religion at the time when everything got written down and declared to be holy and impossible to change. However, other forms of Buddhism, like Mahayana Buddhism, did make changes. They did continue to make changes. And they basically ultimately ignored the written canon and invented a totally new religion in China, in Tibet, in what's now Afghanistan, and of course in Japan. So, spoilers. One of the most interesting complaints offered to the Buddha was in the Saddhamma Patirupaka Sutta. As I mentioned, my ability to pronounce Pali has gotten a bit rusty. You can see the original article to get the correct spelling of the name of that sutta and the textual citation. Anyway, in this sutta, Mahakassapa laments the decline of the religion still within the lifetime of its founder. And I say here, see the Pali text displayed in the first illustration. So again, these complaints about the corruption of Buddhism already existed, apparently while the Buddha was still alive, but at any rate, while the ancient texts were still being written. So, it's like you found a new political party, but within 10 years or 20 years, you already have problems of corruption. You can have problems of political corruption when you start a new religion within the first 1 year. Within the first 10 years, no problem. Sure. So anyway, but that type of debate is preserved in the canon. And Mahakassapa is a critic. We have him complaining. Interesting. He's a critic who took over the leadership. Dissent from the top. In the past, he complains, the number of rules was few, but the number of monks who became properly trained was many. Now, by contrast, there are many rules, but few of the monks are really becoming accomplished in the training. Okay, so just pause. This is interesting. So this would give us the belief that Mahakassapa was of the school of thought that Buddhism should not have an elaborate legal code describing in many, many rules what monks can and cannot do. And that's what we do have now, even in Theravada Buddhism. We have specific rules for can you wear shoes, when you can and can't wear shoes. But generally, the whole religion is very anti-shoe, believe it or not. There are some exceptions. You can wear boots in the cold. About not using an umbrella, about whether or not you can talk to someone who is carrying a sword, who is wearing a sword. There are many minute and particular circumstances that this legal code covers. Exactly what a monk should do if he is seduced by a beautiful woman, under what circumstances, in tremendous detail. But anyway, this is an interesting text because it suggests that Mahakassapa was of a more anti-legal bent, that he was interested in virtue, not legislation. We know from other textual sources also that some of the monks felt that the minor rules should be abolished, that basically there should be major rules, like don't kill anyone, etc. There should be a shorter list of rules for monks, but that following the Buddha's instructions, that the more trivial and detailed rules should be taken away. But that did not happen. That side lost the debate. So it's interesting. If anyone was doing legitimate scholarship on Buddhism and there were real free intellectual discourse, we would have Socratic debate about this stuff. We would have contrasting views between professors and students and Buddhist monks, and we would have progress. And we would have exciting new research on ancient Buddhist philosophy, and we would have original modern philosophy inspired by and appropriating from Buddhism, but doing new and different things from it. Because believe me, the future of Buddhism is not going to be worshiping Indra and his council of gods on the top of Mount Meru. Some aspects of Buddhist philosophy are still inspiring and important today, and others are not. People are not going to go back to worshiping Indra. And the people who are attracted to Buddhism today are normally people who are rejecting either Christianity or Hinduism or some other religion. And they're not getting involved with Buddhism because they want to worship Indra the same way they formerly worshipped some other god. All right, so it is what it is. So in the past, he complained the number of rules was few, but the number of monks who became properly trained was many. Now, by contrast, there are many rules, but few of the monks are really becoming accomplished in the training. This is dissent from the top. One of the foremost monks, and the one monk who eventually took over the leadership of the religion, is complaining that the rules don't work. That is a fundamental challenge to Buddhist orthodoxy, to Buddhist monasticism. This is not trivial. If you care about doctrine, if you care about the history of the religion. Buddhism is a religion built on rules. The complaint against the prolix monastic code from one of its foremost proponents is significant. The fact that the canon preserves dissent of this kind, mixed in with supernatural narratives and all the rest of it, is even more significant. This is a religion that preserved dissent as part of its Bible, including some of the reasons that would-be converts stated for rejecting the teaching of the Buddha. The words of ex-monks who formerly accepted but later rejected the teaching, as well as the arguments of rival philosophers who criticized the Buddha. As in the case of Mahakassapa, we even have evidence of dissent from the top. So, is this stuff historical evidence of anything at all? In general, people answer that question in accordance with their own evaluation of human nature. Although it is easy to imagine that a religion would invent myths to glorify itself, it simply seems difficult to imagine that they would invent myths to criticize themselves within their own canon. Conversely, there is absolutely no distinction between myth and historical fact within the texts of the core canon, as I choose to put it, and we need to be keenly aware of the subjective and emotional nature of the decisions we make in disregarding some texts as fictional and in historicizing others, treating others as historical evidence. Period. That's the end of the article. But the sad fact is, in closing this monologue, I've got to refer you back to the anecdote at the beginning of the article, which is that it was impossible for me to even have a completely respectable, completely academic debate with a university professor of Buddhism about the descriptions of the Buddha's physical appearance, which is not that philosophical. It's just not that big a deal. Nobody cares that much about whether the Buddha was dark-skinned or light-skinned or tall or short. But it is interesting that we do have texts describing the Buddha as a human being and what he looked like to some extent. Many people observe that the New Testament takes almost no interest in what Jesus looked like. The Old Testament takes almost no interest in what Moses looked like. But yeah, we do have some descriptions of the Buddha as a normal human being, not as having fantastic supernatural features in his appearance, as being indistinguishable from other monks, and so on. We know some things about his ethnicity background. But in the 21st century, it is impossible for me to, even with my background, even with properly cited sources from primary source texts, even when I've already done the hard work as a scholar, it's impossible for me to even have a conversation about that with a white Canadian professor of Buddhism. That's how fragile these people are and these institutions are for dealing with the discussions that inevitably arise from the honest and open examination of the historical evidence. So given that example at the start of this article, obviously we are not making progress, and we are never going to make progress in the reevaluation of the Pali Canon as historical texts. It's very sad. I lost, 10 years of my life or more as a scholar of Buddhism. I did a lot of other stuff during those 10 years also. If you look at my resume, I had quite a few interesting jobs. I lived in interesting places. I lived an interesting life. I did humanitarian work. I got out and saw the world, or at least one very interesting part of it, in Cambodia, Laos, Yunnan, etc. But yes, Socratic method is dead, and the pseudo-discipline of Buddhist studies, of academic Buddhology, is profoundly unprepared to deal with the types of really fascinating and compelling issues that arise out of reading these texts. And that's why I quit. Now I've got to get back to doing my Japanese 101 homework.